The type of information I'm going to show you today is the type of information we have to battle online today. We can't be too tired. We can't be too cynical. We can't just let it happen. We have to let the people that have some experience, have some knowledge, have some history behind them talk about these things. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge worth fighting. It's a challenge worth tackling. Now, here's what I want to talk about today. So, there's a YouTube website news show that it's called out there called Redacted. I've never heard of it before, but I'm gonna show you some clips here today. I'm gonna give the website all of its due. Never heard of it, but clearly looks like it's a political show focused on the right, the American right, the pro-Trump, pro-conservative, likely even pro-isolationist view, which are all okay. It's all okay to have the opinions that you want to have in the political sphere, okay? But the challenge is we can't be making opinions, serious people, nonetheless, can't be making opinions, drawing conclusions off just pure conjecture. It helps no one. And when I was researching and doing a bunch of things online today, I came across this interview on this Redacted website with an individual named retired Colonel Doug Macgregor. Now, as I watched the video, I took notes and I looked at everything that he was saying, and so much of it just jumped out to me like, boy, does this need some context? This needs some explanation because Colonel Doug Macgregor seems like a really, really smart individual. I did some background research on him. He's been around a while. He's a veteran. He was involved at the highest levels of the U.S. Army. He clearly is knowledgeable. He's intelligent. He's articulate. And if you look at his history, again, which I did, it demonstrates he knows what he's talking about. But then when he's answering these questions, providing this in what he calls as his informed view on what's happening in particular with Israel and Iran right now, focused mostly on the Israel issue, I'm just listening and I'm saying, none of this is verifiable. This is just emotional rhetoric in order to push a narrative. And again, we live in a free country. We can do these things, right? We can have these opinions on whatever we want politically, but it serves no one if we do it from a basis of ignorance. And it's especially harmful if we do it with people that have backgrounds that are relevant, are filled with successes, and have written books and are highly touted, just like Colonel Doug Macgregor is. To me, those people are even more dangerous because he has to know better. Okay? So here's what I want to do. This isn't a video here to disparage the good colonel. I'm a veteran. I'm still in today, even though clearly all of my opinions here are just on my own. I don't speak for the government. I don't speak for anybody else. These are just my opinions. But as a veteran, as somebody who served in combat, I respect Colonel Macgregor for all he's done, especially, again, working at the highest levels of the U.S. Army in particular. And regardless of what his opinion is, I will always respect it and always give him the opportunity, as we all should, to speak and give his opinion. Okay? But that doesn't make him, at the same time, it doesn't make him shielded from conflict or comment, right? If you're going to put yourself out there on the internet, I don't care what your rank is and what your veteran service is, you still have the ability to be rebutted, retorted, and people who have also served in the military, like myself, can have an opinion as to whether you're spewing like nonsense. It doesn't matter how many books you've written, right? And that's what I want to do today. So let's talk about this video. I want to give some explanations as to why so many of these points are just not valid, or at least based solely on emotion, not fact, and why we really need to make an effort to combat some of this stuff, so we can get as much truth, verifiable information out there as possible. So the video starts off, as you'll see, with the colonel describing what he believes will be Israel's intent to start a war before the November election, just a week away now.
They've got to attack Iran. Netanyahu knows that. He has no choice. The question is one of timing. And this is what people need to understand. It is in his interest, Netanyahu's and Israel's interest, to start this war with Iran before the election. Now, they currently have done everything in their power. That is, Mr. Netanyahu and his agents in the United States pouring vast sums of money into the Trump campaign to ensure that Trump is elected, because Trump has made it abundantly clear that he will support unconditionally whatever the Israelis want to do.
Listen, now clearly in that comment, he's just providing an opinion. He doesn't back it up with any information. He just has this intuition and this feeling. I don't know what else you could say to that other than I guess it's just somebody's opinion. We'll pin this video and we'll talk about it and we'll come back and we'll look at whether that's going to happen or not. I think it's clear to say that's probably a stretch. One of the reasons why I would say that, though, other than just an opinion, is that oftentimes Americans overplay the diplomatic status we have, and we say things like, well, Putin did this because of this president vice that president, and this president or this senator did this, and so therefore Israel had to do that. That's not necessarily the case. Okay. The United States certainly plays in the diplomatic arena. The United States certainly has allies, but not everything the United States does influences every other action in the world. Okay. The Israel is not going to put itself in danger and potentially lead to an all-out conflict with the entire Middle East just because they want to affect the November 5th election, or that affecting the election is a primary goal for them. That's just not the case. Sometimes we overestimate America's influence. Okay. Another thing that I like to point out sometimes is when you have factual mistakes, it begins to indicate what this person's credibility is. Now, I said earlier, the colonel has a long and distinguished career. And if you look at, I'm going to link to his books and I'm going to link to his website. I'm going to give you all of his information. This is not like a pot shot at the colonel. You get to get all of the great things that I'm going to give you access to all the great things he's done in the military. Okay. But doesn't mean you're right all the time. Makes the claim here about the THAADs.
Any of these could be overwhelmed. These two THAAD batteries, terminal high altitude air defense or area defense missiles and radars, are not going to measurably change much, because you are inevitably firing two missiles, sometimes even three, to hit incoming missiles. So you can exhaust whatever is in your magazine quickly. The Iranians, on the other hand, I'm being told, have the capacity to fire 400 missiles and rockets an hour for days.
These THAAD systems are exo-atmospheric anti-ballistic missile capable systems. Okay, they don't attack rockets. He said we don't do rockets. Iron Dome does rockets. David Sling, they are involved in the short to medium range counter rocket, counter drone activity. The THAADs are not involved in that whatsoever. It's a high level strategic system. And so the comment about Iran having 400 missiles and rockets a day and they can continue to fire these on a daily basis for however long they can, therefore exhausting the THAAD system is a non sequitur. The THAAD will never be involved in that anyways. Okay, so here's a comment, which, by the way, if you look into Colonel Macgregor's history here, often relates to his opinion on the Israelis and how, the Jewish state is somehow, operating behind the scenes. I think you get where I'm going here, okay? And he claims here that Israel's intent is to create a greater Israel and take over the rest of the Middle East.
From now on, it's their way or the highway. There is no interim. There is no room for a discussion of a solution that does not involve the wholesale removal of all the Arabs from Israel. And as I said, we seem to have signed on for the Greater Israel Project, we and the British. In other words, we're happy to change the order completely in the Middle East.
Okay, listen, while that is true to an extent, it's not a blanket term for the entirety of Israel. It's the same thing with, let's say, neo-Nazis in the United States. Are they real? Yes. Do they represent a majority of the people? Not even close. The same concept exists for Ukraine. Putin likes to use it as an argument to invade. Are there some neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Of course. Are they the majority? No. Their president is Jewish. It's the same concept here. There are some religious conservative Jewish folks that do believe in a biblical narrative of a greater Israel, that ultimately they'd like to retake portions of Syria and then and Lebanon and other places, because the Old Testament, if you're looking at it from a Christian perspective, in the Old Testament and the Pentateuch, the Torah, they talk about this greater Israel. It is true. But what we can't do is we got to take that minority and then go and say something like Israel wants to do this because of this narrative. That's not the way to talk about things as controversial as this with a factual foundation. That's a tactic that's political, not factual. Remember too, there are a whole lot of Arabs in Israel, 2 million. Loads of them. They work in the Knesset. They're cab drivers. They're service workers. They're also doctors. I know somebody in Tel Aviv I'm a good friend with. Her ophthalmologist is an Arab. She doesn't care. It is what it is. This is not about the Arabs versus the Jews. Okay, that's a narrative that's out there that just simply isn't true. 2 million Arabs live in Israel. Okay, moving on to another point he makes here about the Arabs. I don't really know what he means by the Arabs. The Arabs are a large many millions of different people that live in the Middle East under different nations with different ideals. There's Sunnis, there's Shias. I mean, it's like saying the whites. I don't know what that means. But if he's referring to the majority of the Arab countries in the region, he's forgetting something. Listen.
The Arab states are weak. They're not strongly led. But right now, we are seeing a lot of evidence that, for instance, the Saudis are putting a lot of money into Egyptian banks. We're going to see a lot of that happen with Qatar and the other Arab Emirates putting money in Jordanian banks. This is to stiffen the spine of those countries and remind them that they're Muslims and that they need to get on board with the larger war that's beginning.
Again, we got to find out what we really mean by the Arabs. But even more so, let's talk about the Arab countries that are in the Middle East and what they're doing. We can't forget about the Abraham Accords. This is a Trump, by the way, a Trump administration foreign policy win, in my perspective, but that is developing relationships between the Gulf countries and Israel, Gulf countries in particular, and Israel. Right now, there are flights happening between Dubai and Tel Aviv, commercial travel flights. Why? Because the Arab nations, as they've has said it themselves, this is not conjecture on my part. These are points being made in the diplomatic conversations during the Trump administration, that they understand the future of the Middle East is less reliant on oil, and they foresee a more stable Middle East as with a point to relate more to the West than it does Iran. Iran being the potential negative, not the West. And so there's actually increased relationships coming about between Arab countries in the Middle East, Abraham Accords, and Israel. Next point, there's some comments about soldiers in the Middle East. Listen.
These 57,000 Americans, and maybe more thousands over the coming days, will be joining this. They're all sitting ducks. I mean, it's what we've been saying here on the show, and Americans need to wake up and pay attention to what's happening here. Again, am I being hyperbolic?
Listen, I served with those 57,000 soldiers who were in the Middle East in support of Operation Spartan Shield and Inherent Resolve. Just to take away the fact that I was in Iraq in 2005 in Operation Iraqi Freedom 3. Let's just talk about the recent stuff. I was part of those 57,000 soldiers. It is true that those soldiers are not hardened infantry armor units, right? There's a lot of support elements there. There are a lot of soldiers that are working on military to military engagements, working with our allies, spending time in Jordan and Saudi Arabia and all the other countries that we work with, Kuwait, in the Middle East, to reassure our allies that the United States is there. And so, yes, those 57,000 you're referring to are not the tip of the spear, if you will. That's not their mission. But what that doesn't also include is that the Navy is there in a strategic and operational position. The Air Force is there in a strategic and operational position. Those are two force factors we have to include. And there are response elements throughout the region that are designed specifically to respond to combat events should they arise. And So there's more firepower, if you will, in the Middle East than is something that's often talked about. Okay, so the 57,000 soldiers aren't really quote unquote sitting ducks. I get the hyperbole there, but I guess you're trying to make a point. But let me reassure you, they aren't just quote unquote sitting ducks. Okay, so here's another good one as we wrap this thing up here. Here's a big one about World War III.
We have a small number of people inside the Beltway that have hijacked the government. When I say a small number of people, what are we talking about? 50 to 100 political figures with huge billionaire backing who've been making the decisions and driving policy. You know, we're not in control. We've not been consulted.
Right. Listen, serious and intelligent people can have a conversation about whether we are sitting in a day when World War III is potentially upon us. We can have that conversation. It's, again, serious people can have it. But what we don't want to do is speak lightly about something like that and use conspiratorial rhetoric to prophesy that it's potentially true. Okay, we don't want to say things like, "I know of these 50 to 100 Beltway people that I won't name and I won't talk to you about that are some powerful cabal inside of the Pentagon that's just trying to get Israel to conduct a war for the." I mean, I don't know how much further I have to explain something like that, right? You understand what type of rhetoric that is, okay? If if you want to talk about this powerful cabal of people, like things like Pizzagate and this is the type of language. Just prove it, right? List the names. Let's talk about who it is, and we don't I can assure you, have this tiny group of players behind the scenes that are just manipulating the billions and ultimately potentially trillions of dollars that the government is spending. It just doesn't work that way. Okay. Do you want to talk about a potential for World War III? We could talk about that. It's what we shouldn't be saying is because of these racial or ethnic or conspiratorial theories we're going to have World War III. We can talk about whether it's real a real potential based on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and then the adding of the North Korean troops, which has just happened in the last week. Okay, that's not great. And then South Korea responds and said, "Well, we may send soldiers into Russia or Ukraine in support of them now that there's North Koreans in it." Okay, now we could talk about expanding conflicts. It's becoming multi-frontal. Okay, again, there's serious people that want to have that conversation, right? Claiming that it is going to happen or isn't going to happen, I think is not serious. But nonetheless, let's keep it within the realm of as much fact as we can get our hands on. This one.
What happens if the Israelis decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon against the so-called Iranian nuclear facility, which has to be penetrated, has to go through hundreds of feet of ground to get to it? Well, then that proverbial genie is out of the bottle.
Israel is like Russia, is like the United States. No one is going to use a nuclear first strike. It's just not going to happen. Okay? Some countries might potentially use nuclear weapons if they feel that their existence is in peril, if they are in an existential crisis. Do I think the United States would use a nuclear weapon if the president of the United States felt like the United States would no longer exist in some military conflict? If somebody was literally running over Washington, D.C., and if we didn't strike back, we may go away? Sure. Do I think Putin may do that as well? Potentially, if he feels that he's going to lose the Russian Federation. If I think that, or does Prime Minister Netanyahu think that he's going to lose Israel? Potentially. But Israel is not striking anybody else with nuclear weapons because they think it's the easiest way to conduct that operation. Okay? It is true. Iran's nuclear capabilities are dug underground. It is true. It's a complex operation in order to get after those things. Those things are true. But I would also say that fixed wing aircraft dropping JDAMs with bunker buster capability X amount of 100 feet into the ground, those are not the only capabilities that Israel and in turn the United States have in order to deal with those problems. Let's just put it that way. But that also then leads me to my last and final point here is why Israel didn't strike the oil and nuclear facilities as he had mentioned. And that is because Israel has capabilities it doesn't want anybody else to know. Right? They only want to pull that card, if you will, when the time comes and they have to. The pager operation is a perfect explanation for this. I said it in my last podcast. The pager operation took over a decade to plan. The Israelis know that if they pull that card and blow the pagers against Hezbollah, now they can no longer use that tactic going forward for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years because everyone's going to be watching for it. The same thing is true with the nuclear facilities. It's complicated. It's complex. If Israel is going to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, they're going to give up the goat. They're going to show everybody what their capabilities are. They don't want to do that until they absolutely have to. And because they haven't, that means, like the colonel said, he said that he doesn't believe that Iran has nuclear capability, doesn't have a nuclear weapon at this point or a nuclear warhead. I'll say he's right. And that doesn't even begin to talk about whether they have a warhead that can actually put on a ballistic missile and then they can fire it. And, there's so much more going on here. But the point is, Israel clearly doesn't feel like the nuclear threat is close enough. It's a 50-meter target, so they're not going to give up those capabilities. That's why they didn't strike the nuclear. Okay? It's not something that's in their purview right now. Attacking those military sites and those air defense capabilities was primary and key, and that's why they did it. Okay. I like I said in the very beginning, listen, I'm not here specifically to disparage the good colonel. I clearly see not necessarily a fan of all of his post-military opinions. He did fight in the Battle of 73 Easting. I'm going to link to that. I'll show you his book. His one book in 1997 that I'm going to put up here. It was highly regarded, and potentially he even lost the ability to get promoted because he was kind of pushing against the system, if you will. He was speaking truth to power, and likely the case that he ended up getting blocked because of the truths that he was speaking. So again, this is, I leave you to decide what you think is right or wrong and who you want to watch and who you want to research. Here's his website. You can go to his website as much as you want. Again, here's the Redacted website. You can go follow them, all that you like. This isn't about me going necessarily and trashing everyone, but I do think it's fair and important that we discuss truths based on evidence, based on likelihoods supported by data, when we have serious people like the good colonel who spent so many years in the Army, when they're blasting these opinions out. They have the credibility, and it makes it even worse.